we have what we think is what makes us human, which is our higher order parts of the brain. And that those are primarily in the prefrontal cortex. Those parts of the brain are what gives us executive function, allows us to do critical thinking, allows us to be creative, allows us to have empathy. Those parts of the brain activate in 2 to 3 seconds. So you compare that to our survival brain, which is coming up with decisions in 2/100ths, 3/100ths, cycles through different things that we can do in less than a second, comes up with a decision, and then the prefrontal cortex wakes up. And if the limbic parts of the brain has already decided on something, the prefrontal cortex, its job is to justify what emotionally we've already decided to do. My overall mission is somehow or other to reach some critical mass of people in the world so that we all could be more resourceful, resilient, and collaborative. And so that's really what mind shifting is to get into the mindsets that allow you to be resourceful, resilient, and collaborative. And, the books are just a way of doing that. The courses are a way of doing that. I know that I can't do that on my own. I don't know how I'm going to reach 5 million people, but I just figured with 8 billion people on the planet, if 5 million people were more resourceful, resilient, and collaborative, then all of these clashes that we're having and all these issues that we're facing, which we're not solving, we would have a group of people who could start leading us. And so we would all be leading, happier, more productive lives and solving the issues. And so that's my main focus.
Mhm.
And whether I reach those people primarily through reaching teachers or through business people who incorporate those practices into their businesses, I don't really care. Whether people pick up on some of the things that I'm saying and or other people have said and start mentoring others, that's fine. It's just like we have to get over this divisiveness and lack of progress that we're making as a planet.
No argument here. So maybe
Well,
we could start.
maybe Becky disagrees. I mean,
Yeah,
Fully with you.
it's
Fully
very
with you.
disagreeable. So maybe we could start with those 3 keywords, Mitch.
Okay.
You said resourceful, resilient, and collaborative. Why those 3 words? Why did you stop at 3? Why did you choose those? Did you try others before those? What is it about those particular concepts or keywords that are the crux of the cure, if you will?
So the journey with mind shifting as it really began in 2017 when I had gotten an email from a university in Niger, not Nigeria. Now you two are from, Canada and the UK, and so you understand. Like a lot of
Maps.
Americans are like, what's that? But anyhow, it's about the poorest country in the world. But I got an email from a university asking if I would talk to their undergraduates as an education technology entrepreneur in the US and describe education technology to them. And I was like, something, first of all, education technology in the US isn't going to be the same as it is in Niger. And so me talking about how it's used in the US is going to be, not particularly useful. But the other thing is I was going through this angst myself because I had been in education technology for 15 years with the purpose of using education technology to jumpstart kids so that they could live more productive lives. And I was looking at our education system and nothing had changed. I mean, we were using more technology, but were kids prepared to be adults when they graduated? Were they prepared for careers? Were they prepared for life? No, nothing had really changed. And so I don't know, like all entrepreneurs, you get this flash when somebody asks you for something, said, well, something, what they need? The undergraduates really need to understand how successful people look at situations, come up with solutions, and then persist, even though people disagree with them or they initially fail and somehow or other become successful. And if they understood those mindsets, and I called it sense making at the time, then they could be successful. And so the university gets back to me and says, wow, that's a great idea. Could you come out here for a semester? And I'm thinking, I can't go out to Niger for a semester, but I could teach a 2-day workshop. And then, well, can you teach 2? So we shook hands in, say, July 2017, that I would fly out to Niamey, Niger in 2008, February 2018, and I would teach a 2-day workshop on sense making. And again, as entrepreneurs, you come up with a solution, you try it out, somebody says yes, and it's like, what am I going to do? I don't know how to do this. I've never thought anything like this before. It just seemed like it was something that was needed. So I read 11 books on different topics. I read, economics books, psychology, cognitive science, neuroscience, decision making, coaching, selling, teaching. All of these are ways that seek to help us understand how to do things better. And every discipline had its own slice of, well, this is what you do, but nobody seemed to be putting it all together. And so I kind of reduced it to three different parts. First of all, the part about how do you access the parts of your brain that are more resourceful when you feel that you're stuck, or you feel angry, um, or you're not being successful. So how do you recognize when you're not in a resourceful state of mind? And then how do you turn that around so that you're resourceful? And how do you recognize it in others? And that's kind of the resourceful part of it. And then the second part is, what is it about the way we look at situations that locks us in so that we think there's one right answer, we've got it, or we're going to get it. Anybody who disagrees with us is wrong, and we just have to do that, and all the problems are going to be solved. And that's not what happens in real life. So the second part was, how do you deal with situations when most likely there's more than one right answer? If there is a right answer, maybe nobody knows the right answer. And almost definitely the first thing that you do isn't going to solve the problem. And so you have to be prepared to take information from that, and instead of judging it as failure, take the information and saying, oh, this is what I should adjust, and coming back and trying something else. And so that was the resilience part of it. And then the third part of it was that no matter what we do, we're probably doing it with other people. And some of those people are going to disagree with us. Some of those people are going to try to harm us. Some are going to compete with us. Some of them are going to be dishonest. Some of them we're just not going to like. And our natural tendencies of dealing with those types of situations, either they don't work, or they make the situation worse, or they make it work in the very short term, but have long-term poor effects. But over 50, 60 years, there's been a lot of work about, well, what really does work? And so taking that body of knowledge and pulling it in, and when we go into situations where we're trying to influence people, or sell people, or teach people, or change people, how do we move those from pure destructive conflict to maybe constructive conflict, or maybe avoid conflict altogether, so that we can work together? So those were the three parts that I divided the 2-day workshop into. Flew out to Niger, and at the end of the first 2 days, I'm like, and that's sense making. And the kids, 18 to 25 years old, but the kids they stood up and cheered. And it was like, this is something that nobody teaches. Uh, some people learn some parts of it, but nobody, unless you've really studied it, knows all the different parts. And even then, like, I don't think anybody's an expert, including me. Um, but when people get it, they can see how useful it is. And so from 2018, I started moving away from what I was doing, which is advising education publishers, to how do I change the world? How do I get more people so that they can think this way? And I changed it from sense making to mind shifting. And I don't know how I'm going to reach, a critical mass of people, but right now, I'm teaching courses. Primarily, I teach educators, but business people and counselors and others join in on the courses as well. And through books, and through hopefully training other people who can understand the concepts and teach others.
I see trade-offs everywhere. Um, And with technology, social media, different platforms, we're awash in optionality. But with that comes this possibility of not needing to be resilient. If I don't like you, I can just pivot and ghost you and go somewhere else and try again. And then if I come up against my limits in that new relationship or that new job or whatever the situation is, then I can just ghost and then try again. And I'm not actually growing as much as I might have if we were a small tribe farming or doing whatever, where I'd be uncomfortable on Sunday and then we'd be friends on Monday and we'd both grow and learn something new. However, I can like translate stuff in Italian at the push of a button. I can, learn about nuclear physics at my own pace if I want to. And so there's this trade-off. And I'm curious what you see in your work with mind shifting, because it sounds like you're looking at this globally, with where we are as human beings with at this particular stage in our development, in terms of technological progress, optionality, like I mentioned, and those crucial words that you mentioned: resilience, resourcefulness, and collaboration.
I think we're in a mess, actually. I think that, and I think most people really feel it. Yes, you're not satisfied with something, so you move on to the next thing, or you move on to the next person or the next organization. But you don't feel that you're really making progress. You may use blame. It's like, well, the organization didn't respect me, or this person um, mistreated me, or whatever. But you don't feel like you're really on top of things and controlling the output. And I think a lot of that is exacerbated by technology, and a lot of it is just the way the human brain operates. A good portion of mind shifting, the way I teach it or write about it, is understanding what is it about our brains that leads us to those types of behaviors. And I can go into that a little bit if you'd like. Okay. So, I, and none of this is me, I'm not particularly brilliant, it's just I've had the chance to pull together information from different fields, but, um, an oversimplification of the human brain it could divide the brain into two basic parts. There's the survival primitive parts of the brain, and those parts of the brain are primarily evolved in order for the organism to survive. And they started with the first animals or the first multi-celled organisms that could move. And then you're moving away from threats, or you're attacking threats, and you're eating and you're reproducing, and the organism survives. And those parts of the brain have to be able to react really quickly, focus the entire organism on whatever it is that has happened, and they lock into, they're looking for threats, because if the organism dies, it's not alive anymore, and it's not reproducing. So that those parts of the mind, whether you call them survival brain, lizard brain, the limbic parts of the brain, those react in like 2 to 3 100ths of a second, and most of the time, um, it doesn't have enough information to really fully make a rational decision, but it has to make a decision in order to, um, come up with something that keeps the organism safe. Something is either good or it's bad. It's a threat or it's not. And it's predisposed to look at threats. So the feeling that we're going to be uncomfortable doing something is a threat, as is somebody approaching us with a gun. Each one of those is a threat. And we have 5 different ways of reacting to those types of situations through that part of the brain. Most people are familiar with, fight and flight and freeze. Okay. And those are really the first 3. And then there's the things that we already know how to do really well, our habits or our fluency. So we don't have to think about them. If I'm thirsty, I don't even have to think to reach for something. And I can continue talking while I'm doing it. I can walk and talk at the same time. And so the fourth one is our habits, or the things that we're fluent in, that we don't have to think about. And then the fifth one is copying what other people in our group or our tribe are doing. And,
Fitting in.
you know, copying what the people who are in our group are doing or the people in our tribe are doing, mimicking. Um, because and that capability is what allows us to learn from others, allows us to form groups for defense or to build things. That could be, many people consider that as really what has made our species the prime species on the planet, because we can pull together in groups and we can build technologies, we can build cities, we can build organizations, we can build families, we can learn from each other, and that's propelled the human race to kind of the top of the world. So we so our limbic mind, our limbic parts of the brain, very quickly assesses a situation, mostly as a threat, comes up with something that we've always done in the past, or running away from something, or fighting something, or freezing, or copying what everybody else is doing, and decides what to do, what to do. And then we have what we think is what makes us human, which is our higher order parts of the brain. And that those are primarily in the prefrontal cortex. And again, not just a simplification, that's an oversimplification, but those parts of the brain are what gives us executive function, allows us to do critical thinking, allows us to be creative, allows us to have empathy, allows us to come up with new things, new things that we can do. Those parts of the brain activate in 2 to 3 seconds. So you compare that to our survival brain, which is coming up with decisions in, 2 100ths, 3 100ths, cycles through different things that we can do in less than a second, comes up with a decision. And then the prefrontal cortex wakes up. And if the limbic parts of the brain has already decided on something, it,
Mhm.
it pushes out, stress hormones that limit the ability of our prefrontal cortex to, access all of its capabilities. And the prefrontal cortex, its job is to justify what emotionally we've already decided to do. And you see that with so many things in modern society. And when you talk about people just moving on, it's just like, well, that's what we know how to do. We see a threat, and it may not have been a threat that really endangered our lives. It's just like, well, I don't like this person, so I don't like what this person is posting, so I'm going to ghost them. But if we really could think about it, and if we could access our prefrontal cortex, it's like, hmm, I could learn something from this person, or I may be 90% right. This person may be 90% wrong, but they're probably seeing something that I'm not seeing. Maybe I can have a conversation with them. And, that's, and our social media has been primed, and our leaders are primed because, they've studied all these, and they know, something, if I can get these people in fear mode, then they're not going to have access to the ability to really think, and they'll just follow me. And so let me get them afraid of these things. They'll have all these cognitive biases that people have, confirmation bias, which uh, our brains are conditioned to only look for information that confirms what we already know. And when new information comes in that disputes that, it's like we find excuses to throw that information out. And it's not like only liberals do it, or only conservatives do it, or only Democrats do it, or Republicans. That's what we all do. That's the way our brains are made.
It's that, to me, seems, although I experience it myself, we all do it, I know it to be true. It seems to be evolutionarily not helpful to only look for things that confirm what you already know, considering the amount of threats that may be outside of
Right.
what you know. It seems kind of weird, but that's how our brains work. And the way it's playing out now, I want to lean into the collaboration and kind of conflict piece there.
Uh-huh.
So I think most people's default is to quickly, and we've seen this very much so politically, demonize whatever's not what I think, make an enemy out of whatever's not what I think. And then the way that we interact with each other is not out of curiosity, I want to understand where they're coming from, but out of defense, or out of, as you lent to, leaning on what I might already know, repeating something that I might already know.
Right.
In terms of, as much as I'm with you that we should move towards more curiosity, my skepticism is, can we?
if our brains are set a certain way, or if we can, is it something that takes years and years of practice in some way together?
Well, I hope so.
I hope so
Okay.
too.
So none of us are going to be perfect at it. Okay. But the first step is awareness, I think. So once we become aware that this is the way our brains work, we can use our ability to be self-aware to kind of monitor ourselves. It's like, am I reacting this way because of my limbic brain, because of my survival brain? Uh, and then once we're aware, I usually use, well, four methods, but three methods that we can do ourselves, and then a fourth one to really then quiet our limbic reactions, and then tap into our ability to be curious, and empathetic. And those three reactions are first of all the self awareness. Like sometimes just being aware that, oh my gosh, I'm being limbic again. That's enough. It's like, okay, I got it. I don't have to be that way. Sometimes we can talk to ourselves, um, affirmations or questions that we can ask ourselves. And I think I alluded to this earlier. Was yes, this person is probably wrong, but maybe they're seeing something that I don't see. What could that be? Or if we're in a situation, how can I make this fun? Or changing it, like, I know I really disagree with this person and I think that they're completely wrong, but if I just change my focus right now and I only try to connect with this person, how could I best connect with them? Even though they're going to be constantly trying to trigger me, could I, could I come back 5 times as a curious point of view, even though normally I would react with anger to things that they're saying. So, and that's kind of making a game for it. So the positive self-talk and opening ourselves up is a second way. And a third is through types of distraction. So meditation, mindfulness, taking a walk in nature. Um, for many people, doodling, doing art. For other people, maybe listening to music or making music, doing some sport, but something that then takes our limbic brain out of its fight or flight feelings, lowers those hormones that it's flooding us with, and then allows us to then tap into our prefrontal cortex. And so those are the three things that we can do ourselves. And I find, for myself, they work. When I realize that it's happening, they work most of the time. But then there are times where you need somebody else, and that somebody else could be a trusted person. It really helps to have some trusted people who also understand how the brain works. And so somebody who can basically sometimes just be your, you can't be self-aware, but they can be aware. They could be saying to you, something, Mitch, I think you might be limbic right now, you know, or when you realize it yourself. And this happened to me, I guess, a couple weeks ago, where I was really, really angry with a relative, and I did all three things, and I just couldn't get myself down, back into resourceful mode. And I called my son, who's an adult, and his name is Herb or Herbie. And I'm like, so Herbie, and he knew what had happened, and I just can't calm myself. And he's like, Dad, you wrote the book. Just use some of the techniques of the book. And I'm like, I've tried that. I can't do it. He says, okay. And he just opens up the book. Um, and he says, okay, I'm going to use this technique with you. And he just, used one of the techniques from the book. So, having somebody who understands some of the techniques that, whether in my book or somebody else's book, that work to calm you down, it is the fourth thing that you can do to calm yourself. And then once you're calm and you're in that mode, very often you'll just look at yourself. It's like, hey, why was I so upset about this? That was just it really wasn't meaningful. Or, there's a lesson I can learn from this. Or, gee, I was misinterpreting what the person said.
Arguably, the root of most conflict is
Right.
misassumptions there and misunderstandings. I wanted to dig into the in fact, actually, before I change tact, David, do you
Mhm.
want to jump in on anything there?
Well, I was just going to say it sounds like the odds are kind of stacked against us because the limbic system is moving 100 times faster than the prefrontal cortex. So
You
it's
did that
almost
math in
like,
your head.
well, you made it
You're
easy
right.
for
You're
me.
right. Yes.
But you're inheriting like I could inherit a ledger for 100 enemies I made and justification for that, and then my prefrontal cortex is like, okay, this is what I have to run with. When it sounds like actually I should be maybe curious or like, are these really enemies or could they be allies? Is this a justification based on assumptions? Where do those assumptions come from? And it just seems like there's so much momentum. You're inheriting like this train just moving ahead, and then we have to question like, is this actually going in the right direction? It's like, well, there's a lot of sunk cost in the energy already getting it going. That why don't we just go with that, and then it'll work out, and then that could lead to all sorts of misunderstandings. So I was just I'd love to learn a little bit more concretely. How do you, I saw you mentioned a few different disciplines that you referenced in developing this framework, including military strategy. And I imagine in times of high conflict, life or death situations, you need to be really good at those quick thinking decision makings to incentivize or increase the chances of good outcomes. Um, and how do you do that? Especially like with business, high stakes, fast moving. How do you because it's one thing to question, am I being limbic? Um, yeah, car is in the living room. Was I limbic? It's like that's one thing. How do I know while I'm still on the road? Um, uh, like what can I set myself up for? Could you share a little bit of your framework?
Sure. So just I was thinking before the podcast, like, well, we're going to be talking for a half an hour, maybe an hour, and the courses are, let's see, so 24. The courses last like 40 hours, so the whole framework takes it's a long time to really internalize it and learn it. One of the things I mentioned before is the self-awareness. Just being aware of, am I in limbic mode? Am I um, am I in resourceful mode? Very often, you know, that will tamp our feelings down and give us some access to being resourceful. Another thing is being prepared, and this, and coming from the military strategy, I'm an advocate of uh, uh, I guess, a mechanism called OODA loops, OODA, observe, orient, decide, and act, um, and which was really used, started in the U.S. military in the 1980s, I think, by a colonel, Air Force colonel named John Boyd. Um, and there's really two different OODA loops. In one OODA loop is when you're in the moment. Okay. And when you're in the moment, you almost have to rely on things that you already know how to do, because you're in an argument with somebody. You don't have time to think, well, gee, like, I wonder how this person might do it, or I wonder, let me research another way of getting back to this person. You're right there. And then the other OODA loop is, you tried something and maybe it didn't work. But you have time, because you're going to go back and you're going to meet with this person, and you're going to have a similar situation the next day or the next week. And so you have some time to figure out like what you would do differently next time. And then what you need to do is you have to then take that thing that you would do differently next time, and you have to practice it enough so that when you're in the moment, it becomes one of those habits. And I see your question. I was just one more thing. And you can do that either based on things that you've done, or by simulating, like you're going into a situation and you come up with, well, I'm going into a sales call. and what are the objections that this person might have. And if you can come up with the objections that the person might have, and you can come up with how you're going to meet those objections, you've now internalized them. So when the person says your price is too high, you know immediately that all you have to do is like punch them out, and then you're going to get the sale, right? Because you've practiced that. No, you obviously not punch them out, but you know immediately how to meet that objection because you've practiced it before. This doesn't do so and so, but you've practiced that, coming up with that. Somebody said that objection, and what John Boyd pointed out is that the person who has internalized the most effective responses, and the varied responses, and can deploy them rapidly, that person is going to almost always win. So you use that slow OODA loop to come up with the things that you might do, or the situations that might occur. You practice your responses, whether they're verbal or physical responses in those situations, so that they become internalized. So then when you get into the situation, you have a much wider variety of things that you can use.
I also think it's difficult to stay upset when you're saying OODA loops. It just sounds like a
Right,
cute
right.
little
It's a great term, right?
oompa loompa like term.
Yep.
Calms you right down.
So I wanted to dig into the resilience piece of those
Mhm.
three, because I think like everything, there's a balance. And on one extreme of, I guess, lack of resilience, back to what David was saying earlier, is I meet any sort of resistance and I give up. I don't try again.
Right.
I don't try.
Mhm.
The other extreme might be recklessness or even like craziness to see somebody do the same thing 1,000 times and be maybe ignorant of why actually that isn't worth more of their time. Now, I know it's going to be a case by case thing, but where do you see that balance of resilience so that it's healthy, not to one way or the other?
So, in English, resourcefulness and resilience are very often regarded as synonyms. And really what I'm doing is I'm regarding them as two different things. So in the one sense, if you're always reacting to the situation the same way, that's to me that resourcefulness, or lack of resourcefulness, because you're always responding with the same habits. And um and I guess there's two ways we can improve our habits. One is learning new things to do. So that's that's that slow and that fast doodle loop. To think, what else could I be doing? Let me internalize that, and the next time a situation like this occurs, I'll have more tools. And the second is the self awareness. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm reacting from habit. Let me just try something different, and doing it that way. And then the other part of is the actual, the what I define as the resilience, which is, reacting to, being prepared to act in different types of situations. And I start off with something from a Welsh individual called David Snowden, and he's defined what he calls the Cynefin framework. And he has a whole group around it. And if you haven't heard of it, I defy you to spell Cynefin. It's Cynefin.
Sounds
So,
Welsh.
and that's a Welsh word, and I think it means something like home. And I'm probably still not pronouncing it correctly, but the Cynefin framework, and using his framework, um, that you look at four different types of situations or problems. And so one type of situation is what he now calls, clear or simple problems, which is, you don't even have to think about it, that there's one right solution. I'm thirsty, there's a glass of water, I drink. And our tendency in our limbic system is to think of almost all situations as these clear, simple things. And so I see the solution, I try it, it doesn't work, I failed. Okay. And I move on, or I give up, or I fight, or something like that. And then the second type of situation is what he would call complicated. In a complicated situation, there really are solutions, but there might be multiple solutions. None of them is perfect. They may involve trade offs. And it's much more important for the group of people who we're working with to coalesce around one solution than it is to pick the absolute best solution. So if you think about meetings, okay, people go into meetings and say, this is the right way to do it. No, this is the right way to do it. No, this is the right way to do it. If people went into meetings and they said, you know something, we're probably going to find 4 or 5 really good ways of doing this. There's going to be trade-offs. We'll just pick one and we'll figure out how to do that. Those meetings then become a lot more productive because the meetings are about how you move forward, not these arguments where no side will ever win because no solution is ever going to be perfect. And then the third type of situation also falls into this English problem that we have, that we regard words as synonyms. And these are complex situations. And we think of complex and complicated very often as synonyms. And I've gotten into arguments with people about this. It's like, no, but in systems theory, they're two very different things. And in a complex situation, it's new or novel, and nobody knows what the right solution is. And so in those situations, you can't really come up with something that's going to work, that you can pull everybody around. Nobody knows what's going to work. You have to come up with things that you can try and get information back from. And so probes and OODA loops are perfect for coming up with those probes. Um, and what's important in those probes is that they can't be things that are going to kill us. They can't be things that are going to really hurt us in the long run. So we have to come up with different things that we can try to get information back from, and so we can move forward. And just like a kind of a funny story about this was, I was at an education conference and I was with a woman that I know who was what in the US we call a superintendent, for uh, a school system in Finland. And she was bringing up all the different things that they'd done, and the community was regarded as a very successful community. People were happy, kids were learning, um, and she talked for about 10 or 15 minutes about the different things that she'd done. And one of the superintendents in the US then says, you're talking about the things that you've done that worked out. Tell us about your failures. And she just stopped. And like, probably only about 5 seconds, but it seemed like it was 30 seconds. And then she was like, we don't do things to succeed. We do things to get more information. And so everything that we've done, we've gotten information that we could use. So I don't think there's ever been anything that we've done that's failed, because we've gotten information from everything that we've done. And so in those complex situations, that's the approach. That's the mindset that you need to take, which is very different from complicated. And in those complex situations, one of the things that's really important is that you don't put experts in charge, which seems counterintuitive. But an expert is a person who knows how to do one thing better and better as they proceed through their expertise. And so we don't want the one thing that the expert knows has to be done. What we want are things that we can try to get informations back. And in my opinion, if we look back at the response of the of nations to COVID back 3 or 4 years ago, I think one of the issues is that we had these health experts that were in charge, and they were like, "Well, this is what we actually have to do." And if people had been in charge who were more like, "No, no, nobody really knows what to do. What are some things that we should be trying that we could get information back from?" But instead, we had the experts, and so we doubled down on the things that weren't working because they didn't want it to look wrong. We weren't collecting the right information. We weren't reacting. We were just like, no, this is what you have to do, and this is the only thing that's going to work. So in complex situations, we don't want to put the experts in charge. We need to use the experts so we don't do something stupid. But we have to be trying different things in complicated situations. Those are great for experts. And then we have to coalesce around one of the many things that could work and accept the trade-offs. And simple things, we want to go forward and do it and just make the decision quickly and move on. And then the fourth type of situation are urgent situations. And in those situations, our whole focus has to be on safety and reaching some type of equilibrium status so that we can then figure out, what to do next. And when we're in those types of situations where we generally have fear, very often, we generally have dangers, we're more apt to follow the people who sound like they know what they're talking about. And that's where, politicians, demagogues, even, company leaders, I mean, like, boy, if I can make people afraid enough, I can get them to just follow me and do everything. And so they have this pressure, and social media adds fire to that to get us into these fight and flight reactions so that we just follow or emotionally react to situations, and don't have access to our prefrontal cortices.
I think it's great what you're doing. I imagine at times it could seem like you're trying to swim up a waterfall or, ride against the wind. Um, but I do believe that once people recognize, at least through a few iterations, a few reps, what's possible when you don't give in to the clickbait, let's say on social media, um, and start to be curious, like, oh, I have a strong response to these type of headlines. Why is that? And it you can make change, even though it seems like the numbers are against you. I think it's very meaningful what you're doing, and what you mentioned about specialists earlier. I thought of that adage that to a hammer everything looks like a nail. You have a lot of biases working in unison there, in tandem, where there's a lot of sunk cost. It takes like 12 years of intense study to get a PhD. Um, Believe you me, I'm going to use that PhD to pump gas, to brush my teeth, to cook macaroni. Like everything is going to be looked at through that framework, almost unconsciously. I've been programmed to do that. So yeah, it's counterintuitive. Like knowing when to. And then there's something you mentioned earlier, and I think sometimes we forget about the temporal factor when it's like, you're wrong, I'm right. Um, it's like, even if that is true, and it's not very clear that it is, it might be true in this instant, but it might not be true later today, let alone tomorrow or next week. And it's difficult, I think, at least in my observation, to hold that space. Value Mitch, even though I owned him in that interaction when we were arguing over where to allocate that 10% budget. Um, and it would behoove me to remember that um, you're here, I'm here. We could learn a lot from one another. And in terms of, I guess, the limbic to the prefrontal cortex superposition, I see it currently in um, a difference between like scarcity mindset and growth mindset. So what I try to do is challenge myself to be curious, have curiosity be my North Star. Becky mentioned balance earlier. That's kind of also a word I try to keep in mind: curiosity and balance. Um, and I see it in terms of business development as well, making an investment versus just holding resources, preparing for World War III or building a world that it doesn't happen. Um, and they're two competing frameworks because each side has evidence that the it has happened and it can happen, and depending on who wins,
Right.
it will happen. One might say, and counterintuitively, you kind of are right. Like you make the world you're building, so I can't really argue against you. Like you're right. Um, but I would like, I think I'm right, and ironically, you're I see us operating as if we know enough. Like I feel confident saying that both of you are wrong. Um, is a pretty weird statement if I were to remove myself from it, because it's 2025 and I hope I'm still alive at 2045. And so it's crazy to think that I don't need to know any more than I know now. And so you might ask me, well, David, where are you going to learn, pardon me, where are you going to learn this couple decades of experience that you anticipate needing to carry you the next 20 years? And I would probably answer, I don't know. And it's like, well, then do you think you might listen to Mitch or Becky? It's like, no, they're wrong. It's like, okay, could you try that again? But it's like we often, we just get in that scarcity mindset where it's like zeros and ones, zero sum. And so I just wanted to share the kind of like some of the thoughts that came up when you were mentioning this, the observations you had and the training that you've done in developing this framework. And then ask you, why is it, do you think that with the increase of, I guess you could say like it seems like the lower kind of layer of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where we have running water, we have climate control, we have internet, we have a million friends, quote unquote. We find ourselves less like content.
So, um, I'm going to answer the question, but I'm going to go back to something that you were saying earlier. You're talking about being right or being wrong, and um, how do you justify that, or what causes you to think about that? And one of the things that I've um, told people that kind of shocks them um, is that whenever you are absolutely positive or something about something, that should be your warning signal that it's your limbic mind that's controlling you. Because your limbic mind is just binary. You're right or you're wrong. And so when you're positive of something, that means that you are subject to confirmation bias. You are not open. You're not curious. You're not exploratory. You're not trying to reach empathy with people. You're not thinking about your higher level values. And I think that if you can drill that into your brain, that whenever you're positive, you're probably limbic, and you need to take some of the three steps to be able to walk that down, to be able to access your prefrontal cortex and be curious and be open, that's going to give you, um, the powers to act, to learn, and to move forward. So I think, you touched on that when you were talking earlier. And then your question is like, when, in this environment where we do have our basic needs met, the lower level needs of Maslow, why is it that we still get stuck in this fight or flight mode, and become so positive? Um, and I think that it's like that the limbic parts of our brain are always looking for threats, period. And if the threats aren't the threats of surviving, they're threats that that somebody's going to disagree with us, that somebody's going to think badly of us, that somebody isn't going to like us. And in our limbic brain, that's there's no gradation. It's like, that's not less of a threat than being killed. It's a threat, and therefore we have to react to it. And so it's that binary nature of the survival parts of the brain
Can I double
that
click on
make
that
that.
for a moment?
Yes, please.
You just said something I hadn't heard before or considered before. To the limbic system, all threats are equal.
Yes,
Wow. Did you know that, Becky?
I've heard that before, but not so plainly stated. So to confirm then, there's a bear in front of me, or I have to go up on stage and speak to people.
exactly.
My
Yep.
my body reacts the same way.
Your body reacts the same way. And fMRIs, not that they put a not that they put a bear in front of somebody, but it's the same parts of the
I need
brain that
another
get
volunteer.
activated. Right, right. Oops.
It made me think of what I think might be happening in part to the "I'm right, you're wrong" thing is instant versus delayed gratification. It feels good to feel right now.
Mhm.
Longer
Yep.
term, it's probably better for me to question that more, but that doesn't feel good in the moment to question myself or to have insecurity. It feels better to say, I know what the world is and I'm right in it objectively. And that's true with so many things. It feels great to eat the cookie, but longer term, probably not good for me if I do that too much. It might feel bad to exercise, but long term better for me. And again, it's a weird thing where it feels like our own evolution is working against us in some ways, and we have to
Yes.
override it. And in those moments, choose the longer term growth or the what's better in the bigger picture rather than what feels good right now or avoiding what feels bad right now.
That was beautifully said. Thank you. Yes, I agree with you.
It's
Clear the
interesting, yeah,
way.
because when I thought something similar, and hearing Becky say it, it seems kind of like bizarre. Like, why would our evolution work against us, or why should we have to struggle against it? Why can't it work for us? And to use some of your medicine here, maybe it is. Maybe it's a matter of framework. We often try to, certainly these days, it seems, avoid discomfort, but sometimes that discomfort is the very fuel that we need to drive us to our next level of evolution. And you
And I'll
look at,
just taking that for a moment.
yeah,
If you think back, if I asked you, what were 5 things that you were most proud about? And then kind of probed about each one of those things. And this is actually something that we use in both of the book and the course. If you really think about them, and each one of those, there were times that you felt like giving up. Those were hard things and you persisted anyhow. And so the next time you're faced with a situation and you start getting those feelings like, oh, I'm anxious. It's like, well, wait a minute. I feel that way whenever I'm about to grow. That's just part of growing. That means I'm about to grow again. Or we could say, you know something, I felt those before. Here are 5 times that I've also felt them and I persisted anyhow. And wow, those turned out great. And this is just another one of those times and I can do this again.
beautifully said. Is there anything that you haven't said yet that you want to make sure you mention before we close this podcast?
Well, I think the big thing is to understand that my mission is for everybody listening here and some critical mass in the world, whether it's 5 million people or 100 million people or 2 million people, to be able to think this way. And so, whatever your listeners can do to impart, these practices to others, you know, it, if you have ideas about how I could do it and reach more people, if you want to help and reach more people, people can reach out to me. My website is mindshiftingwithmitch.com. There's a way to reach out to me. There's a way to subscribe to my newsletter if people are interested. Um, you could buy the book. But that's my mission, is that as a world, we're going to survive this epoch. um, if enough people learn to think this way. And that's my mission.
And a fine mission indeed. Thank you for talking to us today.
Well, Becky, David, thank you for having me on your podcast, and hope we can stay in touch.